Mike, let's get started, if you would. Let me just first briefly introduce our speakers for today. And it is my honor to introduce everyone. First, we have Mickey Erday from Halteres and Rich Thayer from Halteres. And also we've got Joris van der Heijden from Starfish Medical. And at the end, we will have Scott Phillips, who's the President and CEO of Starfish Medical. He'll be our moderator today for the Q&A that we'll have after the presentations. So let me just introduce quickly what is Medical Device Playbook. We took our Playbook event online last year. Used to be an in-person event that we hosted a couple times a year, and it gave chance for entrepreneurs and some of our clients to tell a little bit about their challenges and their success stories to share and help others learn. So it's been quite a useful thing. And now I'll tell you just a little bit about Starfish Medical and who we are. We have 2 locations in Victoria, British Columbia, and Toronto, Ontario. We've got over 150 staff. We've also got people in Boston, Massachusetts, and California, and do product development and technology development across the North America. We have a wide variety of clients, both startups and also large companies. And really what we care about is making our clients successful. We do a variety of medical device and diagnostic point of care kinds of products that span all different departments. So without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, who is Mickey Erday. He is the founder and partner at Halteres Associates. And he got his biochemistry PhD from Washington State. His postdoc was at UCSF. He invented the first viral load test for HIV and HCV and began the nucleic acids diagnostic business at Chiron in the Bay Area in the 80s. He has a wide variety of experience in the diagnostic market, and I'm sure you will enjoy hearing from Mickey. There you go, Mickey, thanks.
Thank you very much, and thanks so much for inviting us today. So you'll see Rich and my contact information on the first slide here, and if you'd like to have access to the slides after this, we're happy to send them to you. Just contact us. So let me see. Okay, how do I get this to move forward? Oh, there we go. There are 2 areas we're going to cover today. I'm going to cover success factors for diagnostic companies, and Rich will follow up with using modeling to support business sustainability in troubling times. So there's an old Roman saying that the wise man learns from the mistakes of others, the fool learns from their own. And I wish somebody had told me that 30 years ago. But in fact, what we're going to do right now is talk a bit about some of the successes and failures of other companies and lessons learned. It's quite a lag here for some reason. There we go. So I'm going to cover briefly a project we did for the Gates Foundation way back in 2000. Oops. Okay. It has a mind of its own. I don't seem to be able to get it to go backward. That looks like that works better. Okay. So this was a study we did on 28 companies, and this was because the Gates Foundation was quite interested in understanding why some of the companies they worked with did so well and others didn't. And they asked us to conduct this study. So we did this with 28 companies that we knew very deeply. And we separated them to 3 types of companies. Successes, this was based on their sustainability through revenue generation for at least 3 years, but most of them have done much better than that. People we called zombies, that we'll talk a fair amount about here, which were people that we saw were struggling, and we thought, in our collective opinion, were likely to go out of business with time. We have that history from 2014 I can tell you about, and failures, companies that actually were out of business at the time that we did the study. We also identified specific events we thought were either going to result in the demise of the zombies or did for the failures, and I'll go through that. And we studied this by talking to people who worked at the companies. They were perhaps potentially board members, investors. We got a good feel for what was going on. We're not going to tell you the names of the companies, and it'll be fairly obvious why in a few moments here. But this has been published now. It's in BMJ Innovations if you want to get access to it. Okay, come on. We did this by using a series of phases to look at in the growth of products and try to understand how well companies did and didn't do within them. Let me describe them briefly to you now. Phase 0, design or concept phase. This is before you're actually picking up any pipettes or doing any work. This is understanding the marketplace, understanding the customer, understanding potential competition, and developing a target product profile. And I'll come back to that in a little while, a little more depth. But basically, it's market requirements if you're not accustomed to this type of document. So this is the design phase. Next is the feasibility and planning phase. And this is where you do start picking up some tools and start doing some work. In fact, the end of this phase would be having a prototype that you think is worthy of taking into a formal development program, which is in the very next phase. Phase 2, design and development. Now you're designing it for its ultimate performance that required, and also for manufacturability. This is an issue that has been a problem for a number of companies, and I'll mention that in a moment here. Validation and launch is the next phase. This is where you're preparing for regulatory approvals if they're required, reimbursement, interaction with the medical community, societies, and doing clinical studies. And finally, phase 4 is commercialization, where you're starting to sell, you're getting the information required for payment and reimbursement, and positioning yourself for the marketplace going forward. We took those and pared them down into a smaller number of attributes that fit with all those in these 5 phases. And I'm not going to use that in this next slide, which I know is an eye chart, but please bear with me. I'll go through this. This is the most significant slide we have here. And again, at the top, we've got the phases, the 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and the criteria that we wanted to measure these companies with. We have the companies in the 3 categories: successes, zombies, and failures. And there are more failures than anything else because there are more lessons to be learned with that. And then you'll see that we've scored these with 3 things: success in green, moderate, they did well enough by and large, failed in our opinion, collective opinion. And then we have triggers like the zombie trigger and the failure trigger. And I'll talk about those here right now. And then you'll see in some of the companies down the failures, we convert to these triangles, which are after those companies have gone out of business, so they're not participating in any of those activities. So for the failures, note that a lot of these failures were early on, very early in the process. They, for instance, didn't clearly define the product properly, or they attempted to get the performance required to create a market for this, but they just didn't make it. They didn't have the sensitivity, specificity, robustness, or other attributes. A lot of them went out there. Some of them got a little further along, but in these 2 cases, it really was the management team, which was the problem. They didn't do a good job of running the company. They didn't raise enough money. They didn't do what was necessary. Common, quite frankly. Some of them got further. This particular one was a company that had actually done some clinical studies, looked pretty good, but then they found that they had designed it improperly and could not be manufactured. They were going to have to redesign the product, and investors said no more. Others that got all the way out to clinical studies and failed there because it didn't perform in the field well enough. And then out here, this particular company did an okay job in some areas, but they did not design a product that was going to be reimbursable, so ultimately failed. And this company was out there for nearly 10 years. So some of these were a year or so, some of them very long. Successes did most everything right. There were a couple of places where the moderate score, but they did quite well, and two of them did very, very well. And all except one of these are now parts of other companies that were acquired. The zombies, on the other hand, are interesting. As opposed to the failures, these guys typically got out much further. They some of them did things that we thought were going to result in their failure early on, but some of these got very far out there, and they in fact did not get the reimbursement required for the company. And I'll just tell you, like I said, we did this in 2014. As of now, this month, 7 of these 8 zombies are no longer in the diagnostics business. They're gone. One of them remains, and it's not doing as well as it would like to, but 7 of the 8 are gone. So I think we did a pretty good job of scoring these. We did another score approach to this using numeric values instead of the color values. And as you might imagine, the increase in the score for the successes versus the failures, and zombies lie right in between. I'm not going to address all these questions, but those of you who want to get access to these slides, we have a series of questions that we now use in evaluating companies, evaluating ourselves in a company, and people that have an actual invested in a company or are working with a company, are using questions such as these. These are specific ones in specific phases. Again, you could use those, but what I wanted to focus on here were the things that the investors focused on. So these are people with many years of experience in investing in diagnostic companies, serve on boards, and these are the things they wanted to point out. Firstly, the most important success factor in their experience has been leadership team. Are they capable of doing this? Have they done it before? And not people who worked in tools or in pharma or in biotech, but they've actually done it in diagnostics. They also noted that quality systems must be in place early. Many people wait too long for this, and it becomes the rate limiting step for them. Companies must be able to have the ability to, and desire to partner with others with the requisite expertise, for instance, in reimbursement, in regulatory, perhaps even in manufacturing early on, at a time when they can't afford to bring those people on full time, but they need access to the capability. And are they realistic about the projections for time to market? It can often take 5 to 7 years for successful companies to develop new biomarkers, new platforms, or 3 to 5 years, even if they're extending menu on existing platform. Although we saw in this last year that can be greatly accelerated with a lot more resources and people than would normally be available. And companies must have a very deep understanding of the customer, and that resulted in a lot of those early company failures. Who's going to use this? How will it be used? What alternatives exist? And what does the entire ecosystem look like? Because it may be something like training or laboratory capabilities that are important in addition to your product. And what are the pain points that must be dealt with? Products have got to be designed for manufacturing, and well, I got to remember, these are investors. They must have an attractive ROI for all parties involved. So, and I would like to talk briefly about some of the best practices we noted. And there are a couple of things I want to point out. One is the development of use cases, really understanding how the product is going to be used. And I'm going to give you 3 examples from 10 that we developed for Ebola. We've also done a lot of work on this for SARS-CoV-2, which you can find on our website. But in this case, I want to talk about, again, an epidemic. So this use case would be field detection in a current epidemic setting. And in such a situation, you have to be very careful about recognizing that people are going to be wearing PPE. And so things that they might be able to do without wearing gloves or masks are not going to be possible. In this situation, specificity of the test is not quite as important as in others, because the majority of the people in this epidemic are going to have symptoms which are indicative of Ebola. So you would expect to be able to design for that. That's in contrast to the next of the use cases, which would be screening for Ebola in a site of previous outbreaks, not current. So now specificity becomes a much bigger issue, right? Because a false positive will trigger a response which may be completely overboard. So a product that's designed for this will work in the epidemic, but designed for the epidemic might not work in this post-epidemic setting. And that's something that I think we're going to see a lot of in the SARS-CoV-2 world as well. And then one more example is, we're seeing this again in SARS-CoV-2, you probably want to be thinking about a differential diagnostic in a situation where Ebola might be there, but it might also be Lassa, it might be Marburg, it might be something else. So you have to design for that as well. And we're seeing that with people going to the addition of flu, AB, and RSV for SARS-CoV-2 tests. Another thing that we find that many people do, and this is something we specialize in, you'll find a lot of this on our website, is the design of storyboards. This helps you understand a lot of things. I mean, we use these a great deal. So here's one for TB in a point of care setting. And in fact, this for a community healthcare worker to go to someone's home and test them. So there are three ways you can envision going there. One would be they carry it in a backpack, they carry it on in some way on a bike, or they take it in a car. If you design this product for a car, it's not likely it's going to fit into a backpack. If you design it for the backpack, you certainly will be able to take it by car as well. So understanding all the ways in which you want to deal with the product will be important to that final design. In a situation like this, they might be able to take the materials back to a facility for disposing of them, as opposed to trying to deal with it and burning them on site. So this could be in a clinic instead, and there now that instrument, that system could be large enough that you can leave it sitting on a table. There's a very different set of design criteria, and you don't have to worry about taking it back anywhere, because you could deal with the waste materials on site. Another thing that most people do, and I mentioned this earlier, that do well when they're successes, is they develop target product profiles. They spend a lot of time on this, trying to understand the minimum and optimum performance of the test and attributes of the test required for the marketplace. So minimum means that if all the criteria are met, the product will be acceptable for the application. That's really critical. You know, that means it really is acceptable in that form, versus optimal, which would make it possible for the product to be even better, but there might be issues of the time to get that done or the cost to get that done. And so most of the time we find you end up with the minimum performance characteristics and go into the market with that. So this is a technology independent assessment. And this is an example of a TPP that we performed, that we did some time ago for cryptosporidium. This is one of 4 pages, and just to give you some sense for the sort of quantitative information that we try to generate for this to really understand what the test needs to do, precision, et cetera, so that you're designing the thing that you really need when you go into that phase 1. And lastly, risk mitigation. Some people do this particularly well. And in fact, it's an attribute of companies that do well. Management team has sufficient diagnostic experience. We mentioned that as being something people are very concerned about. So mitigation may be, you know, making sure that you've got people in key positions that have the experience required. So this is, you know, looking at this at one time, but the best practice is to actually use this as an ongoing tool to monitor your progress. So for instance, looking at this on an ongoing basis over several quarters. So this is the management team issue again. You know, they finally did a good job. They hired the people they needed. But you might be in a situation where you didn't assess that risk quite as well as you needed to, and it actually got worse with time. So you need to put additional resources on that, additional effort on it to get it back to where you need to be. So, you know, revisiting risk and mitigation plans on an ongoing basis is something that companies that do well use as a common tool. So with that, then, I'd like to turn this over to my colleague, Rich Thayer, and I'll go to the next slide here. And I think he'll be introduced by Lynn.
Yeah, thanks so much, Mickey. That was very interesting. And we get asked a lot of very similar questions along the way when we are working with clients. So it's really helpful to see some data around that. Thank you very much. And next, I would like to introduce Rich Thayer, who is a managing partner at Halteres with Mickey. And Rich has an undergrad in biochemistry from UC Davis and his MBA from UC Berkeley. He's held a number of leadership positions in the diagnostic industry. He was the director of blood screening and infectious disease business unit at Chiron, co-founder and CFO for Praxis Biosystems, and also was the VP of blood screening at Roche Molecular Systems. So lots of relevant experience, Rich, and we're happy to have you here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lynn, and thank you for the invitation to speak here this morning. Well, we've heard from Mickey several things that a company can do to increase the chances of success in terms of organization structure and objectives, et cetera, and hopefully stave off the possibility of becoming a zombie. What I will spend the next couple of minutes doing is reviewing, well, now that you have a company that has a pretty good chance at success, how does one evaluate whether or not a particular product opportunity, in fact, may lead to a sustainable business opportunity? And to do that, we're going to take a look at business modeling. This is a journey that Halteres started 10 or 12 years ago, in part with funding and support from several organizations. I've listed a couple here: FIND, Unit Aid, Children's Investment Fund Foundation, Gates Foundation, and others. Though this business model has now been applied, or this business modeling approach, in many different chronic and infectious disease areas, including HIV, malaria, tuberculosis, digital chest x-rays, even bioprocessing into oncology, cardiac testing. We've also taken a look at opportunities in high-income countries, so retail pharmacy, urgent care clinics, integrated delivery networks in the United States, as well as all sorts of different levels of health settings in low and middle income countries. The modeling approach works across all of these sectors, and very interestingly, also can be applied to multiple testing technology types and also to devices. So nucleic acid testing, clinical chemistry, next-gen sequencing, et cetera. Rather than try to think about how to explore opportunities or applications in all these areas, in the interest of time and focus today, we're just going to be talking about HIV self-testing and presenting some examples that we have, if you will, contrived for purposes of presentation around the self-testing opportunity. And then I'll conclude with a couple of observations about how the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic has impacted the ability to do business modeling. So quickly, before moving on, just a couple of background slides about business modeling and approaches. The first thing that we have found, and perhaps others in the audience as well, is it's a wonderful tool to help build a common language or lexicon for interacting with your business partners and all the other numerous stakeholders you will come across in the ecosystem you're targeting. It actually helps to clarify roles and responsibilities for these stakeholders, and also delivers, and this is very important for your funders and your venture partners, it helps to deliver or establish metrics and benchmarks for performance and impact. In fact, that's how we get started more than a decade ago developing this model, is exactly to take a look at those endpoint metrics. But one final point to remember, this goes along the lines of the story that Mickey told there. No matter how much global good a company may wish to do, in the end, they have to satisfy their investors. And I hope to present here a couple of examples of exactly how companies may take advantage of opportunities in, for instance, the self-testing market to do just that. So moving on here, one moment, my apologies. A couple of topics or terms that folks are likely aware of: total addressable market, served available market, and analysis scenarios. Many of you are probably very familiar with TAMs. They're a useful rough metric to take a look at comparing, for instance, the opportunity in Southeast Asia for TB testing versus retail pharmacy opportunities in the United States for SARS-CoV-2 testing. Not to sound ridiculous, but it gives you a very high-end apples to apples way to sort of compare overall market opportunities. But otherwise, they really aren't very useful numbers because they don't take into account market dynamics. They don't take into account time to market, various headwinds preventing market adoption and use and scale up, what your competition is going to be doing, et cetera. So in order to address that, the served available market, which is most pertinent for your company in developing your metrics and developing your goals and objectives, it's often instructive to create scenario analyses. So under a particular scenario, understanding the use case, understanding the intended use, knowing what target audience you're going after and for what indications, helps build a much more realistic perspective of what your opportunity is. So very quickly on this slide, if we take a look first at the gray boxes, these are areas traditionally folks will think about first when wanting to develop a business model, taking a look at modeling inputs and outputs. It's typically populated with demographic data, disease epidemiology data, costs and cost to serve the market, et cetera. With outputs, as I just mentioned, looking at TAM and SAM comparisons, what happens with competitors A, B, and C, and importantly, your first look at the financials for the company. But very interesting, with just a little bit more focus and effort, the model can be expanded to deliver quite a bit more. So again, on the left-hand side, if we take a look at here, starting with the key assumptions and making sure there's a firm understanding across all your partners and stakeholders and what you intend to do and why, what your thoughts are about the market. I will come back to this and how that's changed because of the pandemic. Be very clear on the use case, the intended use for your application, where you're going to be using it, and as Mickey mentioned, those target product profile requirements, so those marketing requirements. All of that is inputs and informed through an appropriately designed modeling exercise. In the end, you not only wind up developing your financials, you also can begin to establish your critical path to market, what your next dry well dates are for funding, whether or not the market you've targeted, in fact, would benefit from external market incentives, propping up minimum volume commitments and other ways of ensuring that you can achieve your economies of scale, and finally recommendations. So moving now to some examples of how one might apply this, looking at HIV self-testing. So one of the things that's very important here is making sure in a diagnostics enterprise that your gross margin percentage is high enough to both attract your investors and to continue feeding your own business so your company becomes sustainable. Well, oftentimes in markets, be it in the United States or outside the US, the focus is on the public sector, the government funded sector. There's a belief that funding may be more secure, that those markets may be more predictable, and there's a lot of truth to that. But if you take, for instance, sub-Saharan Africa and look at the WHO Africa region, by golly, on average, just over 25% of the entire healthcare spending opportunity comes from the private sector, not the public sector. With a high in Nigeria of 60% plus, and by the way, in some health conditions and disease areas, that approaches well over 90% to 10% or lower in some of the other countries. This is important to think about because of that gross margin that you're trying to achieve. So in these public markets, if your price per test remains low, but in the private markets, you have an opportunity for a higher test price or average selling price, that blended margin may become more attractive, as shown on the next slide. There we go. So in this case, as volumes increase, and now we are looking at a market that's growing, apologies, also experiencing some internet delays here. Well, I won't go back to that previous slide. So what the previous slide showed was the opportunity to be able to get your cost of goods down to about $1.50 as volumes grow and cross the 10 million unit threshold. And what this slide does is show you, well, okay, that's wonderful. So you're a number 2 player on the market, as shown here in the first bullet. Let's get a very aggressive 25% market share. So you're feeling pretty good. Revenues are growing 25, 28, $30 million. But as you are pushing towards that $1.50 ex-works price, interestingly, at that top orange line, you can see this company focused only on one product, which in this case is the example of HIV self-testing, is still achieving gross margin percentages of under 40%. This company in Mickey's previous presentation would be deemed a zombie immediately. That is just not enough profit coming in to sustain the company operations or to continue to develop a portfolio, compete on manufacturing cost reduction or anything else. And one last point in this slide is to get to this launch, finally in 2020, this product goes out the door. This company has accumulated $12 million in operating debt, which is somehow going to have to be paid back. So not meaning to wish to leave this as a very negative example, it's that in this particular case, this company that looks like they're on a successful track, they're staying away from zombie land, they're evaluating whether or not HIV self-testing is something that might be an appropriate opportunity. Perhaps it could be if they include both private and public markets and they think about very rapid menu follow-on. But one last point before the last slide here is what happens when competition comes. So this company has been successful. They've been able to get to the marketplace. There's still a market leader at 30%, but with your company, you guys both have over half the market. There's a couple of more recent smaller players. There's always the little guys out there nipping at the heels, picking up small market shares and eking away, 10, 20% of the marketplace. But based on the examples just shown, if you're that third or fourth entrant to the market, you are unlikely to have a business that's anywhere close to sustainable. And then on the last slide, some points, take-home messages about the impact of this pandemic. So business modeling and any modeling exercise, I'm sure folks in the audience here understand, is an inexact science, and it's highly dependent on how versed, how well prepared one is to understand the past history of the markets that you're going after, and likely huge impactors to the evolution of that segment looking forward, be it new funding sources, be it changes in policies, programs, etc. Now along comes a giant perturbation like the pandemic, and it's kind of put a lot of that on its ear, both in high income and low and middle income country market segments. And there's just a couple of examples here before I close out. The carefully validated and vetted market trends, the reports that are published, be they from the Urgent Care Association of America, Retail Pharmacy Association, or WHO on various disease states, they now all have a break. They have dotted lines like you would see in baseball statistics, because nobody really knows what they're going to look like going forward. Case in point, tuberculosis disease management has, by all estimates, now been set back 10 years just from the last year of pandemic response. We're seeing priorities changing at the national and at the payer level, impacting infectious and chronic diseases. Preventive medicine has largely gone away, but on the upside, you're seeing huge increases in interest in telemedicine here in the United States. So pros and cons there. You're seeing a very significant overnight change in the developer and the competitor landscape, largely because new funding sources heretofore unavailable have now come out. Going back several years to the Affordable Care Act, driving a lot of the EMR type stuff, the electronic data exchange, all the way to last year's CARES Act and last year's Act A program in Europe, together something $4 or $5 billion pushed into the system for developing new therapeutics and diagnostics for SARS-CoV-2. And finally, the last point to leave you with is with diagnostics manufacturing capacity. Over the last 12 months and looking forward to the next couple of months, global production capacity for diagnostics is projected to increase by several hundreds of millions of tests. So that's all well and good. It's also helping to bring new generations of technology to market globally. This isn't just a high-income country phenomenon. But what happens in the future, 2-3 years from now, when the need for these SARS-CoV-2 tests begins to diminish? What will happen to all that capacity? How will you as a company compete? Will it simply be on price, or are there other innovations that could help you be successful in the market? So as Mickey mentioned, there are many chances and opportunities for preventing your company becoming a zombie, looking at hiring practices and core competencies, but it's just as important now, perhaps more so than ever, to pay attention to your business modeling approach, understand the market and the opportunities, and what the upside possibilities are for the products that you're choosing to focus on. Lynn, thank you.
Thank you so much, Rich. I greatly appreciate it. And it's interesting to hear the critical business things that you need to think about in each of these things, and probably not paid attention to enough, I would say. I just want to note that you can, in the chat, write your questions down. We will have a Q&A after this next speaker is finished. And so please feel free to put any questions you might have in the chat or after that. And our last speaker today is Joris van der Heijden. He is the Bioservices Program Manager at Starfish. Joris holds a PhD from the University of British Columbia and a Master's of Science from the University of Leiden. He was the manager of R&D at Ottawa Hospital Research, and then prior to joining Starfish was the director of R&D at Spartan Bioscience. So Joris has a lot of experience, and we look forward to hearing from you, Joris.
Thank you, Lynn. And thanks, Mickey and Rich. That was very informative. So I want to start by saying that that none of what we've been talking about today, I think to do it all right is not easy. Otherwise, we would all be leading medical device, very successful medical device companies. But definitely, as to Mickey's point, we can learn from other people's stories, and that's what I'm trying to do. I'll try to put some color on some of the concepts that Mickey and Rich have laid out in some case studies, and by far, by and large, I will pick these case studies from the diagnostic space because we're speaking about diagnostics today. But I've also borrowed some cases from some other fields that I think are very relevant to what we're talking about today. And that's going to be the first story I'm talking about. Thinking I might have some delay in the trying to switch to the next slide. Okay, so let's start with market assessment, and this kind of relates to the early stage of development that Mickey laid out. Right in the beginning, you have to think about what's your market, what's the product you're going to develop, and in this case, who's paying? A very simple question. But I have a story about that because so this is a story from outside the diagnostic space. But when I was doing my PhD, my supervisor actually developed a vaccine to prevent humans from getting hamburger disease. So that's EHAC, E. coli 0157, that's carried by cows. And the different thing about this vaccine is that this vaccine was not given to humans; it was actually given to cows. However, here's the kicker: cows normally don't get sick of E. coli. So the farmers that were taking care of these cows and would eventually sell these cows to the meat production plants, they would have to pay for the vaccine, but the vaccine was not helping them in any way. So there was no incentive for the farmers to purchase this vaccine and provide this vaccine to the cows to later on then potentially help humans from not getting this disease. So this is a perfect example because the vaccine is very effective, technically very effective. However, it's still not in use today. So there's clearly something not really thought out, I think, in the business model here. And unfortunately, we're not using it today because it would help prevent food poisoning from happening and associated with hamburger disease. So the other story here I want to talk about is this is a story about the diagnostic space. These are the different segments that you can have diagnostic tests developed in. I just took this from the web, but the reimbursement model is relevant here. So if you think about pharmacogenomics and genetic testing, there's like a large reimbursement. There's a large value that you can get reimbursed for these tests because these tests have been set by a different department at a different time in history. Whereas if you want to pivot to infectious diseases, suddenly the reimbursement model is entirely different. And although technically your product, it being, for example, a genetic test or a serological test, may be perfectly suited to pivot from pharmacogenomics, or genomics that would be a genetic test, from pharmacogenomics to infectious diseases. Technically that makes sense, but from a reimbursement model, from a monetary perspective, that may not make any sense at all. So these are things that you want to consider before you start building your diagnostic empire, for sure. So this is next slide is a standard curve where we see early adopters on the left and basically late adopters or laggards on the right. And this is typical. Like this is not this is taken from textbook from I think was first written in the 60s. But why this is relevant is that there's always people that immediately adopt your product, and so your early market is very different than your late market, and you will have to do something in between to move from one segment of this curve to the next. And I want to put some color on this. There's a variety of hospitals in North America that don't use any point of care tests, and that's mostly decided by a very select group of people in the hospital, and they may have a very good reason for that. But there's like early adopter hospitals that have point of care devices coming in through the back door. Like it's everywhere. And there's other hospitals that would never pivot. And that's generally due to the laboratory manager. So one thing I want to like highlight here is that there's a lot of focus on the user and the use case and the use model, which is super relevant because that's what you need to take into account when you design a product. But another thing you have to think about is who is buying your equipment. If your equipment is being bought by somebody in a hospital environment, then you also have to convince that person, and it can be as simple as one person that makes a decision to onboard your product or not. So definitely a relevant case. So customer needs, it came up in the previous presentation. I again want to go back to point of care. So we've heard the word point of care a lot, especially last year in relation to all the tests coming out for SARS-CoV-2 and like monitoring COVID-19. Point of care, but where is the point of use? And that's kind of like how I start this, because point of care is not very well defined. It's really a continuum, and you fit in somewhere on that continuum. And all the way on the left here, we see home use. And at home, the test needs to be incredibly simple. And think of a pregnancy test or HIV self-testing, which is really like you swap the inside of your cheek and you get a line if you're positive or not. Whereas it's also considered point of care, but it can be in a hospital environment where it's near a patient. Testing is done near a patient, but then clearly that testing is done by a laboratory professional or a nurse, somebody with specific and dedicated training. And it, of course, it's done in an entirely different environment than at home. And think about this as well in relation to the point that we just had discussed. The person that buys the test that's run at home is generally the user themselves. Whereas in a hospital environment, that can be somebody entirely different. So the user versus the purchaser is entirely different. You have to think of all these things when you're developing a product, and point of care is not necessarily enough. You need to be much more critical and specific. So the other example I have here is timing. And of course, this presentation will not be complete if I wouldn't be talking about some COVID-19 tests. Like we've seen the market flooded with COVID-19 tests last year, and they all came out with a different purpose. And or they came out with the same purpose, but you can generally categorize them in a couple of different buckets. And one bucket here is like some of the nucleic acid tests, so the PCR and lab, basically isothermal tests, or detecting of viral proteins, antigen tests, and like rapid testing. And they are answering the question, am I actively infected with SARS-CoV-2? Then there's another set of tests that is not detecting the virus directly. It's actually detecting antibodies against the virus. So these are serological tests. And these serological tests can be done on blood, or there's some people that are experimenting with other patient specimens. However, the question here that's relevant is, was I infected with SARS-CoV-2 in the past? So these tests have been marketed as tests to monitor the spread of infection and monitor if people have had SARS-CoV-2 in the past. But now something's changed, because now we have a vaccine. And what the vaccine does, it makes you generate antibodies against SARS-CoV-2. So every single test that's done that was in this category, in category 2, is now testing positive for everybody that's vaccinated. Clearly, that changes the entire model and environment of this test. So you can see that that people that had these tests on the market they're thinking of rebranding and pivoting. So what can we do instead? Can we think of doing something else with our test? And one of the things that's almost it's a very straightforward way of thinking about like another purpose is to look at the efficacy of vaccines. Can we monitor vaccine efficacy? Can we monitor if people still have protection and high enough antibody titer in their blood so that they are protected, or they may need a booster in the future? Well, that's a great idea, and I think that there's like some other tests that are used in that matter. However, at this point in time, the FDA opposes that. So the FDA and the regulatory bodies are not for this. And I highlighted something here from some of the information I could find, and you can see that several of the big players have their tests lined up. They're well positioned to like play in this space, but they really have the last sentence here says it all. The question is whether the science will firm up enough for authorities to back the plan. So you can see that it's really a cat and mouse game, and you try to position your product, and there's a lot of things that need to fall in place. But if they do, then you have probably a very successful product on the market. So speaking about, so I just spoke a little bit about the FDA and you know, their viewpoint on the use of some of these tests. Another clear story about that is the story of 23andMe, and I thought it's an interesting story because you can see that there can be some regulatory constraints about the success of your product. So 23andMe started operating in a non-regulated space. They marketed their product and they didn't necessarily have a regulatory approval until 2013, when the FDA came and said, "Hey, actually, we need to see some proof of efficacy, and we're going to hold you to the same standards as everybody else." There was a bit of a battle going back and forth, and that battle was kind of resolved in 2017, when in 2017 the FDA granted 23andMe the freedom to market their product. And you can see immediately after that there was an incredible uptick. So 23andMe got very popular and successful. But what I also want to say is that 23andMe was out of the trailblazer of the entire momentum there, and a lot of other companies benefited from 23andMe going through that exercise. So the environment changes quickly and rapidly, and you have to play into that. And it's just interesting to see how many products are suddenly available on Amazon, and you could find every genetic test like in multiple genetic tests just easily available on Amazon. So very, I think, an interesting case of how regulatory interplay can decide about your success or not. And lastly, I want to speak about operational excellence. And I think this really speaks to some of the later stages of development, where I think Mickey and Rich was both speaking about having the right management team in place, but also manufacturability. And this story, I again borrowed this story from outside the diagnostic space, but I think it's relevant because it illustrates the manufacturing question really well. So I used to work for a contract manufacturing organization that was founded by actually somebody that was really interested in oncolytic viruses and had a therapy, an oncolytic virus therapy on the market. And these oncolytic viruses are viruses that are engineered to kill cancer specifically and leave healthy cells alone. Very promising technology. But what's relevant for this story is that oncolytic viruses need to be given to a patient at about 100,000 to 1 million times the dose of a traditional vaccine. So you can already foresee that if you have to give somebody a dose that's that high, you will have to make it that much more pure and clean. So when my previous boss tried to bring this product to market, he found that there was really nowhere where he could manufacture this virus to run the clinical trial. So they had to, instead of just only thinking about the treatment, they actually also had to create their entire manufacturing space and the manufacturing infrastructure around the treatment. And they did that successfully, and they currently have several products in the market. So it was a successful company eventually, but it obviously took a lot more time to do that. So there's definitely a consideration that needs to be taken into account early on. And then there's COVID-19 put a big lens on this, but single source like supply chain management. Does anyone have any of these? I just took a couple of different headlines here. They're in abundance found on the internet, but the pandemic put a real strain on the global supply of materials. But in general, you can say that if you're single source for some of the critical materials in your manufacturing setup, you're at risk of not succeeding. So you have to think about all these things up front. And you can see like how this, I think, is really illustrated is that if you look at the most popular COVID-19 test, there's 230 diagnostic tests that were approved for COVID-19 early on last year, and think about which ones are the most used today. Those are mostly the ones used from the big players. So I think what that illustrates is that there is a big factor that's operational excellence that plays into that, because these companies are very well laid out for this and set up for this, and they adhere to a lot of these critical parameters that Mickey and Rich were highlighting, that we all need to adhere to in order for us to make a successful product. And they do that well, and that's why they are successful. So this is the last slide. I think with that, I'll hand it back over to you, Lynn.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Joris. And I think we'll have Scott come on and he will moderate the Q&A.
All right, here we are. Okay, well, this has been totally amazing. So there's so much wisdom in those presentations. It's hard to know where to start. And let me just so I've got one question from our audience, and then I'll come up with some other questions for our audience here in just a moment. So this is from Vipula Taylor. Thank you for this informative session. I would like to hear speakers' opinions on a combination of diagnostics and treatment devices, especially in infectious disease space, bacterial infection, specific HEIs, SSIs. Thank you. So who would like to answer that question?
I can take a stab. Infectious disease, that might be more difficult. You know, we see it more in non-communicable diseases like diabetes, of course, where people are trying to do that. It's been an effort going on a very, very long time in order to monitor, for instance, the glucose levels of diabetics and respond as though you have a pancreas that's functional. But infectious disease, I'm not sure what the individual might have in mind here. Would it be, treating a chronic infectious disease with antibiotics and monitoring the performance, or, in HIV, would you switch drugs with the automated system if you found an individual became resistant? I'm not sure I understand what the notion is. Mm-hmm. Maybe others do.
Okay, we've got a follow-up clarification: preventions of infections at catheter sites, non-pharmaceutical, it says.
I see. Rich, do you have any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, that would be the real-time monitoring for, viral, bacterial, gram-positive, gram-negative type infections, and immediate administration of appropriate drugs. We've also seen some of that, and hopefully this isn't too far venturing afield here, moving out of the IVD space to the in vivo space, and real-time visual monitoring of surgeries, infections, clearances, and that sort of thing, to guide the process that's going on, more so than drug delivery. Mickey, you mentioned AMR, and that's maybe the closest that comes to mind. Is there drug susceptibility, or do you have the appropriate treatment regimen? That's not necessarily a real-time link, right? To changing right then and there your drug therapy. It's really more advice to the treating physician and then a new script written.
Right. Use the right drug first.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to jump back to the beginning of the presentation, start with Mickey. So there are a couple of things I noticed on your chart there. You talked about the importance of a experienced diagnostic team. I couldn't help but notice that all of your successes had experienced teams. And in fact, even 4 of the zombies had strong teams. So I wonder if you could talk about, sort of more specifically, any observations about team strength and how they contributed to success.
Yeah. I think sometimes teams have been successful before go into a new area and think that what they did before will work again. And that isn't necessarily the case. The best teams actually start from scratch as though they don't know anything and do the things they did before that were successful, understanding the environment, which has probably changed since the last time they did it, and just being very, very careful about what they do. So an experienced team isn't enough. Doing things right the second time is as important as whether they've done it before. And it shouldn't be said that people that have never done it before can't be successful. That's certainly not the case. But those individuals typically will have surrounded themselves with mentors and others that help them come up to speed. So that's really, really important. People who assume they know everything not having done it before are in real trouble. But people
Mhm.
who will accept advice from others is very, very valuable and essential.
So in
And
other words, you
one-
need go ahead, Rich.
I'm sorry, just one additional point that perhaps is a nuance lost in that simple graphic is when to do a teamectomy. You know, your startup team, even in these successful companies that had a good team to start out with, isn't necessarily the right team during the growth stage and when that company is pushing for menu expansion, et cetera. So that's sort of a follow-on, Mickey, to your risk assessment. Is our team still the right team?
Right.
Mhm.
Very important point.
Great. Okay, let's jump down to Rich, and I'll come back to you in a minute, Mickey. But so you talked about scenario analysis and sort of how do you get from the total addressable market to this the SAM, and do you have any specific sort of tips for people struggling with those deciding what to do, basically?
Yeah, that's actually a good question, and a difficult one to answer quickly. It really comes back to understanding very deeply the environment in which you hope to sell your product. As was pointed out in the third presentation, Joris, by you, understanding that you're developing a point of care test isn't sufficient. You need to know, is it being used at a hospital? Is it bedside? Is it point of need? Is it being used in the home? Is it being used in a health outpost or a level 1 health center or a retail pharmacy? That's all critical to understanding the scenario in which your test is going to be used and what the impact is of that result. You know, many times point of care tests suffer because the result still is not actionable. There's another test or there's another activity that needs to occur before a fully informed treatment decision can be made. So understanding that as well and how that limits your opportunity for upside traction and sales growth.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
You
Okay,
might add to that. So, you know, it's also then all those things you need to be successful in the marketplace in terms of interaction with the thought leaders and societies, and, you know, what's the mechanism by which you're going to get reimbursement, because those are all the reality components of this. That TAM may look really attractive, but all those hurdles to get to your share of the SAM can be long, expensive, and difficult.
Great. Okay, well, let's jump over to Joris then. I love that idea that just sort of like the big idea has a lot of complexity in it. You could just fall into a hole. So the idea, hey, there's this big TAM, so therefore we'll be successful. And maybe similarly with Joris raised the issue that point of care is actually only used by half the hospitals, and so if you don't understand that and you just go blundering along, and maybe the hospitals don't use it, are the ones that are in your target. Do you have any more color to add to that, Joris?
Yeah, I can. Well, a little bit more color. I know that even some of the big manufacturers out there, and I won't name any names, but they have specifically singled out hospitals where they don't put any sales force on these hospitals because they have just categorized these hospitals are laggers, and they're just waiting for the dedicated person to be removed from their position or eventually retire before they will start putting pressure on those hospitals again. So that's how difficult it is, I think, to sometimes convince certain people of a specific space. Now, clearly, the pandemic has really changed our thinking of testing and diagnostic in the diagnostic space. So it probably has gotten some people on board that maybe were in the past were not on board, but it is incredibly difficult to convince the laggards in the graph to take on your technology if they're hesitant for whatever reason. They probably have a good reason for themselves to take that on.
Great. Okay, let's jump back to Mickey. So we have a question from Ihor Bosco. He talks about how to prioritize the keys to success depending on the stage of the company. Because in essence, your keys seem to go from left to right across the stages of maturity of a company. So how do you just what do you focus on in the seed stage versus Series B? How do you map your criteria across?
Good question. You know, really, I think most of the most successful companies have thought that all the way through from the beginning. You know, that they know what their objective is. Do they want to be a fully integrated company? Do they want to sell to someone else? And do they have some other liquidation event? And they think about each step in terms of deliverables. You know, what can we get done in the earliest phase that would be attractive to an investor? what will be the next phase, and think in terms of getting that done in such a time frame that you have enough time to raise the money after that as well. So it really just depends on what the product is. You know, in the earliest phase, you got to have a really well thought through idea. You know, you have to understand what the market is, back to Joris's thoughts here, you know, and also you understand what the competition looks like, you understand the IP, you understand what the performance characteristics are going to have to be and why. You really just understand those things. And at that point, you know, you may have a lot of ideas as to what the technology is and will do, but you're really clear on what it must do in order for you to be successful. And then you thought through, you know, the steps after that. Once we get done with this plan, we're going to develop a prototype. It's going to be something like this. And then we're going to go into formal development, and we're going to do all those other things. And these are the points where we will have created value that should be therefore worth your while to come in at a later round and invest more money. We're decreasing the risk as time goes on. That's the most critical thing.
So maybe on a related, the note is if you look at the ones at the top of your chart, they basically are green all the way across. In other words, they don't really have any weaknesses. They obviously have, you know, relative weaknesses, but they could have a couple yellows. But you know, I'm curious what your thoughts. You know, there's this sort of movement these days to say everybody should focus on their strengths. But it seems like if you're a company, you should focus on having no major weaknesses. Do you have any thoughts about that?
And it's also not making mistakes. You know, that's going back to that whole thing again, learning from the mistakes of others. It's so critical because most of those other companies that failed, they made a critical mistake early on, didn't realize it, and neither did their investors. Most of them raised a lot of money. But you know, it's not a coincidence that when we look at those companies that were successes, that they were successful because of the processes they used. They were very careful in thinking through the marketplace. They tortured themselves on what they should do. They changed what they were doing if they found it wasn't working. You know, they thought about sustainability, thought about scalability, you know, all those kinds of things. But some of them got kind of lucky too. You know, we can't discount that. You know, the markets ended up bigger than they expected for some reason. You know, those look at all those success stories of the last year with COVID, where people were working on a platform, you know, that was going down the path for maybe flu or something else. And oh my gosh, that's just what we needed for COVID. And a lot of those companies probably would be out of business right now if that hadn't happened. So we can't discount luck in this too.
You got to be incredibly bold and determined, but also open and flexible just at the right times, and also lucky. So that's
right. Well, so what is the old saying from Seneca? Luck is the meeting of preparation and opportunity.
There you go. Perfect.
So that's what we're talking about.
Okay, let's jump over to Rich. Maybe we'll go for another 5-10 minutes here. And so I was very interested in your modeling of the sort of increasing complexity after you launch, the market responds, and you're anticipating that market response and still planning to win. And I'm curious, sort of how does that happen? Or is it's just that you intimately know all the players and you can guess what they're going to do? Or
that's a really good question, and the quick answer to your final question there is no. You know some of the players, right? You know some of it, what should happen, but one of the things that we have found very useful in a well-planned modeling exercise is taking enough time upfront to make sure you and your participants, your partners, fully understand the assumptions. What is behind the model? What is behind your inputs? Because what that does is allow you to go back, and we do this frequently, to those assumptions and ask, you know, is it quarterly? Is it on the cycle that Mickey's described? And ask ourselves, again, with our partners, what has changed? How do we need to update this model and do it with the same framework and the same baseline that we used to establish the initial interest in the business? And by going through that opportunity, one can recognize, oops, SARS came, this is a much better opportunity than we thought, or wow, there's a new competitor, or look at that, WHO is no longer endorsing the use of CD4 testing for HIV. That market's suddenly gone, but we're lucky because we have a crypto product, or we have a viral load product, or we have something else. So you understand the setting, the demographics, the epidemiology is still there, but your particular opportunity has fallen away. And rather than continue to plow forward and launch it anyway in the hopes that lightning will strike, coming back to this framework is an opportunity to back off of that and move on to your next venue opportunity. So it comes back to the strength of those assumptions, your understanding of what's behind those assumptions, and using that to keep your model a dynamic document.
You're kind of talking about resilience of entrepreneurs as well, that you kind of bet on yourself. You will succeed, but this particular thing you're doing might be an experiment that doesn't deserve to succeed, and you'll just that's a kind of a subtle skill that experienced entrepreneurs learn to have, and junior ones, they're still infused with this notion that they must carry on with this thing no matter what. So it's that's super interesting. Let me jump over to Joris. So you brought up Anne Wojcicki from 23andMe, which was in some ways a story of hubris, right? She just went and did I remember when the FDA said, yeah, you haven't validated these tests, you can't sell these tests, they're diagnostic, and she said, screw you, I totally can. She just kind of went at them like a cat, and maybe that's the wrong metaphor, but like a Wolverine, and yet in the end she kind of reached an accommodation with them and sort of won. I'm kind of wondering if I don't know how much you've studied her story, but what did she learn from that, and how did she figure out how to overcome that challenge?
Well, I probably a little bit less intimately familiar with that story than you are, but I think it is interesting to see that, though, that she was pushing the boundaries, and I think that often comes with an entrepreneur, right? They have a vision, then they're pushing the boundaries, and in this case, she was butting heads with the FDA, which is not a nice organization to butt heads with, because they're quite powerful and they're immediately related to your success story. But I think in her case, it did work out eventually, and it paved the way for a lot of other companies. And I think what I wanted to showcase there really is that you sometimes need a couple of people that are the trailblazers. Right? They are the true entrepreneurs that are like building the infrastructure for everybody else to contribute, so that everybody else can contribute to that same space as well. I think another story I think that I just spoke about that related to that was a story about those oncolytic viruses. Like, they were really difficult to make, and a lot of companies were kind of waiting for, like, okay, we have a treatment, we would like to start clinical trials, but we can't really do that until one person says, well, I'll bite the bullet, I'll make the manufacturing facility, and I'll set it all up, and everybody comes to my facility, and I'll help everybody else out as well. And now there's a whole environment and a whole bunch of therapies in that are helping people today. So you need a couple of really smart people, but also really, they don't need to be daredevils. They need to not be stopped by a little bit of a hurdle along the way.
Great, thank you, Joris. So let's go back to the the questions here, and then I'm going to talk a little bit or ask you about the post-COVID. So a question here from Vipula: could speakers elaborate on the type of team for manufacturing environment? So late stage, and you guys have studied the makeup of teams at that stage. Which person wants to talk about that?
I'm not sure I completely understood. To assure that you have a very good manufacturing environment?
I guess could speakers elaborate on the type of team for a manufacturing environment? So late stage, how does the team need to change to get to the manufacturing phase, I guess?
Well, I think most companies that do very well think about manufacturing right at the beginning. Some of them actually will hire manufacturing firms, or they hire manufacturing people, or they have development people who are very aware of that, but they don't wait, too late to say, now it's time to think about manufacturing. And, one of the companies that was in that study of ours did that. We knew the company very well. They had done these in-field studies that looked very good. And then we helped them bring in some potential OEMs to make the product. And they all looked at it and go, that's really cute, but you can't make it. You're gonna have to start over again. We've got to redesign that thing. Those tolerances in injection molding or something else, you know, these materials you chose, they're just not manufacturable. So, you know, it is from the beginning, you have to have that manufacturing environment where you're planning for what you're going to have to do right at the start. And I'm sure you guys see this all the time in Starfish. It's bewildering sometimes that people wait so long to engage people who are experts in that area.
You know, Mickey, if I might add to that, and I say somewhat tongue in cheek, you know, most of the people in the industry are happy to leave regulatory and legal kind of off the design team, right? We don't need to deal with those guys, and we'll let them, you know, take care of things for us at the end of the day. And again, that's somewhat tongue in cheek and not appropriate. But with manufacturing, it's oftentimes, and we've seen this even when the top 10 diagnostic companies, it's oftentimes the thought on project teams that manufacturing can reduce costs. Manufacturing can design a more efficient production process, et cetera, after we're done with all this important development. And to your point, Mickey, it's too late by then. You're stuck with your material selection. You're stuck with your vendors. Oftentimes, you're stuck with your cost profile. And even the very largest players are not able to modify that in time to meet market expectations and go-to-market planning. So that's something, to your point, that should be very early stages. You know, stage one manufacturing should be part of that design team.
Now, just to build on that slightly, another area people often don't recognize as important is process development, not just product development. Right, that scale-up process early enough. You know, making a buffer in a 100 milliliter, you know, graduated cylinder is very different from doing it in a giant vat. And if you don't start working on those things early on, you may never get there in time. You may have spent way too much money. You may realize that you did something wrong right at the beginning that didn't permit you to scale up like that. You know, that process development piece is critical.
And with that, Mickey, right, you also include QC test methods development. You can't design in quality, right? So how are you going to test for product performance to the end, and is it doable?
Yeah, allow you to kill that venture and move on to the next one if there's no way to test it in process, right?
Yeah, exactly.
We have unfortunately seen that happen, Scott, at the very end of the product development. You could not spend enough money to appropriately test and verify product performance, and that was the end of it.
Isn't that incredible?
Yeah.
Get cut off at the knees at the very last day. That's the. So I wonder if we could just sort of wrap up by talking about the sort of post-COVID environment. I know, and I'll ask each of you a variation of this question. So. Rich, you talked about big perturbations right now. TB is being set back 10 years. Preventive medicine is also cut way back, but more remote medicine and a bunch more diagnostic capacity. Seems like, or diagnostic manufacturing capacity. Seems like this is a big shift to the landscape, which creates opportunity for agile, smaller companies, right? Can you talk a little bit about those shifts and what it means for people in the audience here?
Absolutely concur with that. One thing that Mickey and I are very excited about is the opportunity for entrepreneurs and small technology and menu developers. So as the larger players, and many have added 200, 300, 500 million test strip manufacturing capacity this year alone, you know, times multiple providers. They won't have the development engine, right, to keep that full themselves. They're going to look to partners. They're going to look to acquisitions. They're going to look to actually how to become more competitive without competing only on price, as some of the big players are wont to do eventually. So it seems like it's a wonderful opportunity for the smaller companies that have the next good product, that have the next assays that are going to be required. Mickey mentioned respiratory. What happens as we move forward into this fall and the next year? Are we going to want differential diagnostics that chiefly and at the point of care per jury want to differentiate you know, what the respiratory infection is? Is it RSV? Is it flu AB? Is it SARS? So understanding these opportunities and making sure that you can deliver a validated set of feasibility data to the larger players if you yourself don't have the capacity is a new opportunity for market entry.
Fantastic. Okay, Joris, what are you have any thoughts on this subject?
Yeah, so I think we've seen a lot of different tests come out, and I think because it had to be done so quickly, Mickey was already kind of like alluding to that, a lot of that was repurposing, right, of like tests that were developed for another purpose, and they maybe now repurposed it for COVID-19. I think we're still waiting, especially like to really break into the at-home space. We're still waiting for some technologies that are going to allow us to do so. Whether it's new technologies, whether it's equipment that's as robust as could be, or as simple to use as could be to really break into the at-home space. I think we're going to see some interesting developments there to like really allow users at home to know the status of their health at all times. And we also will see maybe some of those technology already exist. And I think small companies have been a little less successful, as I spoke about, like a little less successful at like, really taking the entire market. You'll see big players coming in, scooping up some of those smaller players, and maybe, taking those technologies and making them into the new successful products of the future.
Great, thank you. All right, Mickey, I'll give you the final word, unless you guys want to have a debate here, which is totally great. So,
so far, no, I don't think so. I want to build out the home testing Joris was just talking about a little bit here, in that it's very interesting. Testing in general has become so much the talk of the town everywhere because of COVID, and the notion of self-test has been around a long time, but we've never really had a great economic situation with home testing, maybe except for pregnancy testing and glucose testing, a few small things like that. But the notion that you can take care of people at home as well or better than in a clinic is just catching on. One recent thing that we thought was really interesting was United Health is sending these packages out to their members that have a home flu test and also tamivir in it. So that if you come up positive, you just start treating yourself, and which is almost necessary because the drug only works in the first 24 to 48 hours. So that's an interesting paradigm, a big change. But right now, most of the time when you get a home test and then you call your doctor, they want you to get another test. They don't trust the home test, or it's not in their system, or for some other reason they're not using those results to make a clinical decision. That really needs to change, or we're just adding costs. So we really want to get to a situation where home testing is an extension of clinical testing to make the right kind of clinical decisions. And if people take the right steps, this is an enormous opportunity that is never been more clear, never been better. And I guess lastly is, I hope we learn our lesson in how to prepare for the next pandemic, because it's going to come. Just in the last few years, we had H1N1, we've had Ebola, all these things, it's just time. And so will we do the right things so that we do this better next time? And I think the jury's out.
and what do you think those things would be?
Firstly, being able to monitor the fact that the new organisms are present in the population. So having very good surveillance programs, communication systems. I don't know if this is still the case, Rich, but the CDC mostly gets the reports from public health in faxes. I mean, come on, guys. And then having stockpiles. There are going to be stockpiles, I think, of diagnostic tests that could be put in place very quickly. The drugs, there are going to be drugs which we know are going to be effective against a lot of viruses or bacteria that we can have stockpiled. We have also tamivir stockpiled right now in the United States, a $9 billion investment for the next flu epidemic, but that may not be what we see. So there are a lot of things that can be done.
Wow, so it's a lot to do with public health is mostly what you're talking about.
Yeah,
yeah,
that is
amazing.
True.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you so much to our speakers, Mickey Urdea, Rich Thayer, and Joris van der Heijden. Totally wonderful talk today. And this will be on our website in a few days in case you want to pass this along to anybody else you think would benefit by this. And we'll be having another event, which we'll be announcing over the next week or so in about a month. So look forward to seeing you on that. Thank you.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Fun.